بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. It's so lovely to be with you all. And I always have, I think because of the nature of what I teach, I always have very male audiences. And it's always wonderful for me to see this beautiful audience of Muslim women. And it's really beautiful, but it's also sad at the other side that Muslim men don't think that this is important for them to be a part of. And so while I'm so, Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much, brother. You are our brave representative. I appreciate you. And my son, too, who's here just because he has to be. So this is a really important topic. And in my next talk later today at 2:30, I'm going to talk about the systemic level of Islamophobia in America today and how it's increasingly targeting Muslim women and why that is and why Muslim women, the so-called symbols of Islam, are under attack today. And if you saw my last press event where I talked about the strategic attacking of Congresswoman Ilhan Omar and what that means for the rest of us when she's regularly attacked and we actually feel the violent impact of that. Why is that happening? I'm going to talk a lot more about that, statistically speaking, through my research later today. But what I want to focus on now is talking about the legacy of women in America and the nature of feminism in America and its evolution and how we sometimes see ourselves separate from it, or that we need to have an Islamic feminism. So I want to challenge all of that, right? I want to talk about the legacy of feminism in the United States, how we have adopted or misadopted a prism or a lens, and I want to problematize that. And then I want to talk about what does it mean to actually incorporate a notion of Islamic feminism as Muslim American women today, and why it's necessary in this moment where we are the religious minority grouping that is attacked most in America. So when we think about this kind of framing of the discussion, I want to clarify our terms because we need to make some distinctions. When we talk about Islam and, for example, the Arab Middle East, we talk about it as an experience over there. And I want to decouple our understanding of experiences of Islam with Islam as well. And so when we say, for example, the kind of story of Islamic experience in the Arab world, it's very different from the ones in Asia, Africa, the former Soviet Union, and the rest of the world, and even here in the United States. So I want to challenge how we kind of look at this experiential understanding of Islam and talk about Islam as faith in Scripture. Right? Really taking it to its essence so that we can understand how it's extremely important for us to understand the Islamic feminist narrative in our everyday lived experiences here in the United States. So I'm going to be a professor for 10 minutes really quick and talk about feminism and its evolution. And I want for us to really understand that it comes out of a particular 18th century European experience, where the economic, legal, and social political constructs of the time were political thought centered around this great debate between two wealthy white men, Edmund Burke and Thomas Paine. And they criticized the idea of natural rights as a rationale for violent revolution, and they both defended it, focusing on naturally the relative rights of men. And so through philosophers that come later, like Mary Wollstonecraft, feminism arises as a counter to this based on the natural right of men and the rationality of men, arguing that women indeed were fundamentally rational beings. When we talk about radical ideologies, or I teach a course on ideology, one of the first radical ideologies is feminism because it's a radical notion that women are indeed human beings. When we think about the embedded birth of this, it's a distinct historical experience of European white males. And it emerges as a reaction to this. So today, when I'm asked to say, can you talk about Islam and feminism? And connoting that these are, like, by default, two separate things, that they're two separate entities that we as enlightened Muslims in the West are putting in conversation for the first time together because they otherwise would not meet. And I want to challenge this understanding because when I say Islam and feminism or Islam and human rights or Islam and environmentalism or Islam and all these other things, we're acting as if Islam had not already theorized all of this. and that we are, for the first time, putting them in conversation because we need to talk about, does Islam give us rights, right? And when we continue to talk about Islam and rights through this prism that is a Western European construct where the debate was on the rationality of women are indeed human beings, and we want to negotiate Islam with it, what we end up doing is stripping our faith of its beauty, its core essence, and everything that's imbibed within it in terms of rights and who we are as persons in front of Allah. And so I really want us to challenge this notion. So when we talk about women's rights today, we actually talk about them in the Western construct as separate from men's rights, right? This does not exist in Islam, right? That women's rights are separate, right? And I'm going to go through this in a bit more detail. So what I want us to do, all of us today, is to stop defining us, ourselves, and defining our faith not by what Islam is not, but by what it is. And so when we do that, we break the kind of narrow boundaries of these Western theories, and we open up the unlimitedness of our own. And so it's not Islam and feminism, or women's rights, or Islam and the preservation of humanity, but the preservation of humanity, which is the core essence of our rights as Muslims, is the essence of Islam. And by looking at the issue in this light, we can begin to deconstruct the assumption that they're separate, right? And that we, for the first time, or Muslims in the West, are going to start negotiating this understanding of rights of women as if it had not already been theorized. So let's begin. When we think about the notion of feminism in the West, the topic itself centers on the questions of personhood, identity, the body, and agency. And in some respects, it comes from the assumption that he is the subject, he is the respect, he is the individual, and we are the other, right? It comes from this assumption. And we think about what this means. The other women are non-subject, non-person, non-agent. In essence, we are mere bodies. And that's why politics is often, both here in the Middle East and throughout the world, negotiated on the bodies of women. And I want us to be very careful that sometimes we actually pick up these narratives and negotiate politics on our own bodies. And I want to challenge that. So when we think about law, practice, structure, cultural stereotypes, women's selfhood, being insan, really, selfhood in the West has been subordinated, diminished, belittled, and outright denied. So we're cast as lesser forms. And it's really important for us to understand the legacy of feminism in the West, especially in the United States, because our experiences, whether we like it or not, are fundamentally tied to this. And so feminism has this interesting relationship to power, where the more active women are in society, the more suspect they become. The more active and visibly active women are in society, the more suspect they become. They become accused of being social agitators, of bringing down the family, of bringing down morality, and attempting to undermine state power. And in many ways, activist women here in the United States have always been referred to, one of my colleagues says, suspect citizens, where women who, in their attempt to be active members of democracy, are seen as undermining it. And so all of us who want to be active members of society as women, as Muslim women, as women of color, as immigrants, as refugees, have all of this against us because all women in the West who are active are seen as what? Trying to undermine the status quo and cultural norms where women are meant to be invisible. And visible women, active women, are seen as attempting to undermine society, the norms that say women have a place. Similar to how we talk historically about people of color having a place. And when they're socially active and move out of that place, they attempt to undermine the status quo, and so they cannot. And so I want us to understand Why? And I'll talk more about this later tonight. The notion of a visibly active woman, add to that a Muslim woman, a woman of color, becomes exponentially more threatening to the status quo. And so this is what we need to be aware of in terms of this legacy of women in the West and what they go through. And that's just the first wave, where we're talking about officially mandated inequalities, where women were trying to gain the right to vote, right? To be equal citizens, right? We're talking about still back then. The second wave of the 1960s were focused on unofficial inequalities, about increasing economic opportunity for women and ending social discrimination against women, right? And so we're still struggling this, coupled with the civil rights movement, about are women supposed to have equal access to opportunity? I'll move very quickly to the third wave, where academics begin to talk about, well, how do we see the injustices in things like the way we study people, and literature, and poetry, and science, right? And we're still struggling with this today in very simple ways. For example, what's the average temperature of a human? We talk about 98.7. That's the average temperature of a white male, right? We know that women's standards are much less in terms of what our average temperature is. But think about what this means for all of the health sciences, right? And how all of it is gendered. And by women entering the health sciences as researchers and challenging the assumption of what indeed is the norm for a human, aim to undermine all of science of the human body, right? I mean, think about that even in science. So, how then, knowing that this is the experience, and I went through like 3 courses in about 5 minutes, right? How does that come to us, for us to kind of articulate an Islamic understanding of feminism? And again, I'm kind of doing the same violence that I dislike, right? Where I'm saying Islamic feminism, right? But I want us to understand that this is part of our faith, right? Where it's Islam, right? But because we have not yet established a clear understanding of Islam, allow me to say Islamic feminism, but that's what I mean. So if we understand the context of pre-Islamic Arabia, like really quickly, in pre-Islamic Arabia, where there was no real rule of law, no power structure, and that there was kind of the rule of the powerful dominate the weak. And so as a byproduct of this system, in many regards, was the oppression of women, where we know about female infanticide. I mean, imagine this, burying girls alive. And girls were seen as like burdens and disgrace, and boys were valued so much more. Boys brought wealth, girls brought burden. When women were deprived of basic insaniya, right, humanity, forget about being able to choose your husband or divorce or inherit. You're property at this time, right? You're property. And the only ruling structure is the powerful tribal structure. And so a society like that looks at power as the ordering principle of society, right? What organizes society? It's that power structure. And I want you to think about what Islam does at that moment. In the birth of Islam, where the ordering principle used to be power, the birth of Islam leads to this major paradigm shift, where the ordering principle, or the first ordering principle, is no longer power, but it's justice. It's adl. It's equality. It's that, right? Which brings what we're going to talk about in terms of humanity in a few minutes. This principle of iman brings this, the first ordering principle in Islam is no longer power, but it's justice. And the right to justice becomes the first human right in Islam. Right? It becomes the first human right. And this is really important because Islam has given humanity, and I want you to listen to the nuance in the Quran. It says, we've sent messengers with scriptures with clear signs. Why? So that mankind upholds justice. This is why all of our prophets were sent. Justice in this ayah comes before ihsan, adl before ihsan. And what is ihsan? It's the highest level of iman. So the establishment of justice, equality, becomes first. And it's not for men, it's for all. So I want you to think about what we're talking about here, where the spiritual equality of personhood is what brings the first principles of Islam. And so here we start to see that women, 1,400 years ago, I mean, think about what the establishment of the masjid does, right? And the masjid, I just want you to think about a space where everyone can enter. And who's everyone? It's not privileged white men. It's not men. It's everyone. And who enters first? It's women and the poor and the former slaves, those who had been historically denied personhood. And so if that is our Islamic legacy, right, to be members of society, like I really want you to think about the first democratic space is an Islamic space, right? The first democratic space, don't ever build everything, can democracy come to the Middle East? No, no. The first democratic space is an Islamic space where everyone enters. Everyone matters equally, right? We're not negotiating whether women are equally human, what they're still going to do 400 years later in the West. And so when we talk about Islamic empowerment, it is the principle of Islam. And if it's denied to you by anyone, especially a male power structure here in the West, or anywhere else, because it still exists everywhere, then essentially what we're being denied is our ability to practice our faith as it was designed for all of us. And so when we think about the social political structure of the West today, where women, right, how much do women earn for every man's dollar? 76 cents? And how much do women of color, actually black women, earn for every man's dollar? 64 cents? And what we learned last year on International Women's Day is that Hispanic women earn how much for every man's dollar? 43 cents. Less than half. So what that means for all of us is by the time the fall rolls around, we're now working for free. And what that means for women of color, by the time the summer begins, they're working for free. And those are the structures of injustice. They permeate in everyday life. Where, for example, the debate happening in Texas, and I don't want to get controversial, is not about a religious access to abortion, but it's at how we control women's bodies. Not in what they can do, but in where they can go, and how we can limit their negotiation in space, right? And so I want you to be aware of certain negotiations here in the West are really about the elimination of women from the public sphere. It's not about a conservative assumption about what you can and cannot do religiously. No, it's about the elimination of women from the public sphere, because part of this core essence is that socially active women, politically active women, threaten all of society as it's established for the male-dominant status quo. Visibly Muslim women today, and again, I'll talk more about this later today, are the most targeted religious minority group. Because by the virtue of our existence, just our existence in the public sphere is an undermining of the status quo, where women should not be visible. But not only are we visible, we physically mark our bodies as Muslim. And so the unfortunate byproduct of that is that we become the victims of violence. And in the interview, towards the end of it, it kind of got controversial, but I said to the interviewer, I said, at the end, I want you to look at what's going to happen in the South in the coming months, where the most powerful American woman in America today is who? Someone gets extra credit on their final if they get this right. No, not Michelle Obama. Huh? Not Kamala. Who's the most powerful woman in America today who has the power to get people elected? Stacey Abrams, I'll give you the secret, right? Stacey Abrams, a woman of color, is able to get more people elected than in our history, mobilize people to vote. I want you to follow what will be the attacks on her and on women of color in the coming months. Because here's a social agitator. What was she able to do by mobilizing those in Georgia? 2 Democrats elected who led to the swing, right? So it's not just the stories of Muslim women or the effects of Islamophobia, which again I'll talk about later today, but that our narratives is fundamentally tied to what has been happening to women of color historically in the United States. Because they have historically been what? The biggest social agitators for change. And that their advocacy for rights are really where our advocacy for rights come from. So when we talk about structural injustice in the United States, I know it's easy for us to talk about the growth of Islamophobia and the Islamophobia industry, but I want you to understand that the narrative against Muslim women is built on the narrative against women of color. And as we see what will be the increasing unfortunate violence against women of color because of what's going to be increasing attacks on people like Stacey Abrams, we're going to see the after effects in all of our communities. There's a reason why they go after Ilhan. And I want you to be aware of that politically and visibly active women are seen historically in the United States and in the West as social agitators that aim to undermine the status quo, as if it's a zero sum. And the more we have voice, the more others don't. And we need to flip that, right? Where, although most of us in this room are privileged, we can't continue to let women in America earn 76 cents and 64 cents and 43 cents on every man's dollar, where we're still talking about first, second, and third wave feminism, and our faith guaranteed it to us from day one. And even all those men who are not in the room, except for you, brother, and I appreciate you, who continue to perpetuate Western forms of oppression within our faith communities, need to understand the violence they do to our faith by not upholding the principles of our faith. Thank you.